kind of ironic. I just spent time visiting with 4 of your graduate students in photography, and I think the one thing in common with all of the visits is I advised them not to talk too much about their photography. That really wasn't their business. Their business is to make pictures. So here I am standing here to talk about my photography. So, you know, I was already going to start with a kind of a warning, and that is that you got to be careful listening to photographers talk. It's not their business. And sometimes they say really crazy things, and they say them as though they believe them. And sometimes the greater a photographer is, the greater the craziness of what they say. For example, one of my favorite quotes in all of photography is from the great French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, one of my own heroes, and he actually said, "Photography takes no brains at all. It takes sensitivity of eye, 1 finger and 2 legs." But of course, like every kind of crazy statement, or most crazy statements, somewhere down in there there's a little germ of truth. James Agee, the great American writer, writing about Helen Levitt's photographs, kind of echoed faintly that idea when he quoted the German poet-philosopher Goethe, whose advice to visual artists was, "It's good to think. It's better to think and look. And it's best to look without thinking." So today I'm going to talk about my photography and photo bookmaking on a project. And I would say that my advice to photographers and my own experience in photography and bookmaking is a bit different than that. I would say my advice is think in advance, stop thinking when you photograph, then think again. So I'm going to talk about this project photographing along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Mexico. I was able to spend almost 8 years photographing. It's a big stretch of territory that I covered, about 1,200 miles. And I went back repeatedly, photographing sometimes pieces of the coast and sometimes traveling the entire coast. And I think the best idea to give you a general sense of my intent on the project, as well as some of the challenges that I thought I was facing along the way, would be to read to you from an email that I wrote in June of 2008, 6 years into the project, to Shannon Davies, an editor at Texas A&M Press, who had been recommended to me as the best editor in the business. As I read this email to Shannon to you, I'll show you a few photographs in advance, showing you photographs from the project, some of which were in the book and some were not. Now, how do I change the slide here? Oh, I've got to go out right here. Go down there. There we go. This is from June 16, 2008. Dear Shannon Davis, I'm hoping that Texas A&M Press might be interested in the book I'm working on, and that you in particular might be willing to help me with it. I will describe the project in the book as briefly as I can. My original idea, going back to 2002, was to do a landscape study of the western shore of the Gulf of Mexico, including Texas and the Mexican states of Tamaulipas and Veracruz. In 2002, I traveled to parts of the southern coast of Veracruz for the first time and was able to see volcanoes, rainforests, and steep mountains over the sea. This area, the Los Tuxtlas area of Mexico, struck me as more beautiful than Hawaii, and who knows about it. The same year, while photographing on a ranch on the East Texas coast, near High Island, I was impressed by the flatness of the land and the seemingly endless expanse of salt grass. At that time, I decided that perhaps these 2 points, about 1,200 miles apart, could be the beginning and the end point, sort of the bookends of a study of this coast. From the beginning, there were 3 things that interested me about the project. First, I wanted to make a visual record of the natural landscape of the coast at this point in time. It seemed to me that no one had ever photographed the landscape of the coast, particularly the Mexican coast, all that well, and I wanted to make an enduring record of it. Second, the history of the coast fascinated me, particularly the important but often overlooked role that the Gulf of Mexico played in the discovery of the New World. Robert Reynolds' book, Spanish Sea, along with his other two books on the Gulf, history of the Gulf Coast, have been my constant companions as I have traveled and pursued this project. In my previous book, A Long Forgotten River, I placed my photographs of the landscape along Buffalo Bayou with historical text taken from the writings of the earliest travelers to see the same landscape. And I was pleased with the result. So I was looking for a way to let some of the rich history of the Gulf Coast resonate with the photographs that I would make. My third interest was to make photographs that describe the two cultures that have developed along the coast. Traveling the coastal highways, it occurred to me, would provide an ideal way of looking at and ultimately comparing vernacular roadside evidence of these two cultures. About a year into the project, it dawned on me that one way to describe what I was doing was I was photographing the coast of New Spain 500 years after the discovery of the New World. About a year ago, after many days and nights in the library, I gave up on the idea that the text could be fragments of historical sources. First of all, I couldn't find what I needed in historical sources to go with the photographs. What had worked for the landscape along Buffalo Bayou simply wouldn't work for the Gulf Coast. More importantly, as I photographed, as I traveled, I encountered people and had experiences that could not be captured in photographs. But their stories begged to be told, as they brought human context to both my photography and to the history of the coast. So I decided that the text should be a narration of my travels, that I would have to write it, and that it should include ruminations into the grand history of the place, and that is what I've tried to write for the past year. At this point in time, what I have is the following: 1,700 rolls of film, color film that describe the Gulf Coast from Sabine Pass to the tip of Veracruz. The pictures start in the Port Arthur, Sabine Pass area, where they suggest a disturbing and cautionary tale about the changing contemporary landscape. And they conclude 1,200 miles down the coast on an ancient stone road that passes through a rainforest leading to the sea. Over the past year, I've written about 120,000 words of text, made about 700 proof prints, and drafted a digital layout of the book. I've tried to merge all of my short trips along various parts of the coast into one continuous narrative journey. And for the past few years, I've found myself constantly trying to come to terms with the disturbing changes of the landscape along the coast. For this reason, in addition to describing what I saw along the coast, some of the people I met, the adventures I had, and the history that was always swirling in my head, in addition to all that, the text contains a personal lament for the landscape that is disappearing. Can one book possibly be about so many different things? I don't know. That's probably the first question that I need help from you in answering. The challenge in part is that the pictures in the text need to be edited with an eye to the pictures and an ear to the text so that they finally work together. The book that I envision might be described as an illustrated travel journal with extended contemplations on the history of the region, in which the text and the photographs play more or less equal role. So if I haven't worn you out with this long description, could I persuade you to have a look at what I've done and see if you would like to work with me on the book? Shannon Davis, thankfully, indeed the best editor around, agreed to work with me, and 2.5 years later, the book came out. A&M Press came through in great form with subtle but very important refinements to my design, sensitive editing of the text, and an enlarged book. I submitted 336 pages thinking they would require me to cut it to maximum 240, but instead it grew to 360. So now let's have a look at selected images from the book along with passages from the text. Sometimes I'm going to read from the book, and sometimes I'm going to summarize in an effort to move through a fair amount of material pretty quickly. And we're going to follow the geography of the coastline, just as the book does. And tell a few of the stories that I heard along the way. So, Gulf of Mexico from Google Earth, there it is. And the territory I'm going to cover is from roughly 12 o'clock on the clock with the Gulf and moving around to about 6 o'clock on the Gulf. And it's around 600 miles of U.S. coast and a little over 600 miles of Mexico coast. I show you the roads for this reason, to point out to you that there are very few points at which the roads actually move along the coast. So if you want to see the coast, you have to drive these major highways, and in most cases, you take little roads or big roads from the main highways down to the coast. So that's what you'll see me doing. I mean, I'll point out that in Mexico, for example, I moved from San Fernando out to the coast, and then I moved from one point to another out to the coast. But there are a few points, like right here, you get to where actually the road parallels the Gulf, right on it. You're within 100 feet of the Gulf of Mexico, but there's no point like that really in the United States. So we're going to begin with this section of the coast, which is the kind of northeasternmost part of the Texas coast, and we're going to move from, we're going to start in Houston where I leave my home and take off and go over to Port Arthur and the Sabine River, which is the Texas-Louisiana border, and then we're going to move down to Freeport in the first part. Then we'll kind of come back to a map. Reading from the book. It's early in the morning, the middle of January, and rain showers have been falling all night. I'm driving north in heavy traffic, inching along the freeway that skirts the western side of downtown Houston. I can see the brown waters of Buffalo Bayou, swollen from the rains of the past few days, swirling below the roadway. On an overpass just 100 yards to my right, cars and trucks are circling the city, moving barely above the rushing water. Vines climb up from the water to the very edge of the city streets. Houston's going to make a magnificent set of ruins one day. About an hour and a half east of Houston and then slightly south, I'm at Port Arthur. The first picture here of Port Arthur is from the Gulf Gate Bridge over the Sabine River, looking down, and you can see the houses of the original part of the town, wood framed houses, and then you can see the many refineries that circle the town. Down on the streets of Port Arthur, my first impression is this is a ghost town. The streets are empty, except for a few lonely souls strolling around, and the air has a foul odor. Here and there you can find lingering evidence of the grand city that this once was, like this beautiful shell wall on Proctor Street. But basically the place is deserted. This is Proctor Street looking through the center of what was downtown Port Arthur. In the Museum of the Gulf Coast, the only establishment I can find open on Proctor Street, I peruse galleries dedicated to the heroes of Port Arthur. The local trinity of Janis Joplin, Robert Rauschenberg, and the great football coach Jimmy Johnson. Out on the street, I'm photographing the old Port Arthur Savings Building when a balding man in a white jacket steps around the corner and calls to me. "Hey," he says, "you want to see something?" His question sounded like a proposition. I actually thought he had adult movies to show me. His name, he said, was Jerry Fontenot, and what he has to show me really was quite something. It's a tiny one-room barber shop, and my first impression of the place as I walk in, having left the museum, was that surely I have stumbled upon the true and original source of Robert Rauschenberg's famous combine. Virtually every square inch of the four walls is covered with news clippings, wedding portraits, snapshots of fishermen. There are Playboy pinups, portraits of virtually everyone who's made the news in the last 60 years. This is a 3D Rauschenberg combine in real life. Charity points out a dozen vintage hand-colored postcards of Port Arthur from the 1930s. He looks wistfully at the cards and begins to tell me what a great town Port Arthur was back then. It was an open city, complete with nightclubs, gambling, prostitution, good times for all. Sailors, he said, would sail around the world and wait to be back in Port Arthur to have an evening of good times. So what happened, I asked? The do-gooders he screams. That's what brought this place down. The do-gooder politicians that made their reputation taking away people's pleasures. I noticed a photograph of Janis Joplin near the cash register. If I recall correctly, she more or less fled Port Arthur, never to return. Did Janis Joplin ever come to the barber shop, I asked? Oh yes, Jerry says. She used to come in here with her dad, and a lot of people assume that she left Port Arthur because she didn't like it here. But that's just not the truth. The real reason is right here, he says, picking up a well-worn copy of Playboy magazine, marked with a page and an interview with Joplin. She tells you right here, just read it yourself. She says, at 14, I had no tits. That's the reason she left. And you can see she's telling the truth right here. She was an underdeveloped teenage girl, and she was embarrassed. And she was self-conscious, so she left. She had no problem with Port Arthur. Back out on Proctor Street, I'm thinking, I wonder if it was the underdevelopment or it was the smell of the place. It's a weird, strange, disagreeable place to be now, and I can't imagine why anybody is still there or near it. Highway 87 takes me south out of Port Arthur to Sabine Pass. I made this picture from the top of a drilling rig, and it's looking across the Sabine River at the shore of Louisiana. So this is really, along with Port Arthur itself, this kind of topographically is the beginning of the 1,200 miles or so that I cover. Highway 87, once completed its journey all the way down to Galveston, but now the road is out. You get about 12 miles out of Sabine Pass, and this is what you hit. It's a mess, and you can drive it. If you've got 2.5 hours, you can drive from Sabine Pass down to the Bolivar Peninsula, but you'll have to dodge big globs of tar on the beach and all sorts of junk. But if you make it, you're on the Redneck Riviera. This place has changed a lot since the last 2 hurricanes that have come through, but it's a place of, simple abodes and trailers, of signs and shops. And let me say in advance, there are certain subjects which have an enduring appeal for me. I am constantly looking for signs. I'll show you a couple of really great signs in a minute, but look at this. I mean, this tells you almost all you need to know about High Island and the Bolivar Peninsula. These signs about Jesus and hairdos and propane deliveries. Anyway, I love to photograph signs, and I love to photograph vernacular architecture, that is, buildings that are built without an architect, or just what people put up on the side of the road, like this beautiful souvenir shop. I won't spend too long talking about Galveston. I could spend an hour talking about it, but I'm going to just mention a couple of things that I love to photograph things that have a sense of time, history, and sometimes even kind of decay about them. Photography, someone once said, is limited by the fact that you can only photograph the present. That's true, but there's plenty of evidence of the past. This oak tree, which has become one with this wrought iron fence, is one of my favorite things in Galveston. The whole historical district of Galveston is one of my favorite places. I expect to see Miss Havisham come out of a house at any moment whenever I'm there. I also love Mardi Gras time in Galveston, and that kind of takes me to the other great strength of photography. Besides being able to photograph evidence of time past, you're able to photograph instantaneous pictures of the moment. This band in Mardi Gras, I mean, I love looking at the faces of these guys and their marching position. Photography has always been a miracle to me in its descriptive power. The idea that I can release the shutter and my film or my sensor will record all this detail is still nothing short of a miracle for me. And I have a penchant for marching bands. These girls are the drill squad of Kashmir High School. South of Galveston, you're on to the Freeport area. which is quite interesting. Freeport has almost disappeared. You know, there are towns that have come and gone along the coast. Very close to Freeport were the towns of Velasco and Quintana, both of which were finally not rebuilt after numerous hurricanes came through and swept them away. Freeport is kind of disappearing for a different reason. Dow Chemical came in, I think in the early 60s, and built a big plant. It brought a lot of jobs and good things to the area, but it kind of killed Freeport because the people that came to work for Dow mostly established another community, Lake Jackson, which has no history, but is a kind of more comfortable, more genteel kind of place to live. But I'm driving around Freeport looking in, you know, it's made for me. This is another example of vernacular architecture. I mean, I can't stay away from certain things. The shape, the beauty of this building appeals to me, and of course it's nearly gone. Someone once, Wright Morris, the great photographer, once said, photography is best at photographing things that are going, gone. And I love, these are so American and so Southern American. These funny, humble little buildings. On 6th Street, a man sits on the steps in front of a tiny white wood frame building. It's a beautiful building with a perfectly square facade and a sloped, simple roof. A handmade sign over the door identifies this as Gutierrez Barbershop. So I stop. Are you Senor Gutierrez? Yes, I'm Butch. I said, Butch? Bacho, same as Butch. Bacho for Ambrosia. It's Bacho, but they call me Butch here. How long you been cutting hair here, Butch? Oh man, I was raised here. Back when this place was alive. You know, it's kind of a ghost town now. So many people, when they get a good job, they leave here. They get a house in Lake Jackson or somewhere, but I was raised here. It was a beautiful, distinctive way that Bacho said raised, with his voice rising and drawing out the word for emphasis. A very Mexican inflection and very expressive. What do you call this neighborhood? Oh, this here is the east side. Same beautiful rising of the voice on the word east. Not so many people live here now, and it's mostly old people that still do. I remember when this place was alive, man. This place, what's my shop now? This place was my mama's cafe back when I was a kid. We had a jukebox, and we was open 24 hours, never closed. My sister and me, we helped my mother in the cafe. My sister would be helping her cook. I didn't really learn to cook till I was older. Now I'm a hell of a cook. I can cook anything you want. Chili, bake a cake, you name it. That's my hobby. But back then I was just a kid, and I would be sweeping the floor and cleaning up the place for my mama. But now it's a ghost town. Well, what keeps you here, I asked. Well, I got a pretty good business here. You know, I cut everybody's hair. I cut the men's hair, cut the women's hair. I do it all, and I cook for people. Just yesterday I cooked a pot of chili for a big wedding. I do good. I like it here. Yeah, we got a mayor that's talking about putting in a big marina down here. Now I'm going to tell you how smart he is. Last week he got run over twice by his own lawnmower. Twice. He fell down, it ran him over, and he rolled over and let it run him over again. Twice. Now that ain't all that smart. I'm not all that smart, but I'm going to get out of the damn way after my lawnmower runs over me one time. Hell, he's going to get me twice. And he's the same mayor saying we're going to have a marina. So I leave Bacho with his 5 o'clock appointment, a young Hispanic man who walks into the shop with a full head of black hair, baggy blue jeans worn down around his hips, and a purple t-shirt that reads, "She looked good last night." I promise to bring Bacho a photograph, and I leave for the Brazos River. So now we're past Freeport, and we're headed down the coast toward the Mexican border. A recurrent theme in the writings of the early explorers, including Columbus, Christopher Columbus, and Hernan Cortez, was the existential urge to know what they called the secrets of a place. I look at a map like this, and I just want to know the secrets of the place. Now, my ideas of the secrets of a place are definitely different than Columbus or Cortez. Cortez was fascinated with things like armadillos and ceiba trees. I'm fascinated with, I guess, different things, and some people would call them insignificant, maybe even silly things, but I submit to you this masterpiece of graphic design and social statement. Let me read it to you, in case you have trouble. The FBI have been harassing me for over 8 years. How long did the FBI, the United States government, harass people in the United States? Who gives the FBI the authority to harass people in the United States? I've been through 9 years of harassment. I'm getting sick and tired of being harassed. Who do the FBI of the United States government think they are? Signed, Joseph C. Dunn, Palacios, Texas. I looked for Joseph C. Dunn for 2 years, and he wasn't to be found. Now, I suspect he was around, but I suspect there were other people looking for him. And I never located him. So I just have to wonder, is he still there? But what a statement, what a beautiful piece of work. And then there's this one, another great sign. This came from Highway 35 on the way to Bay City. Nothing for sale, don't ask. I stopped instantly on the highway when I saw this magnificent sign. And the lady who lived there meant what she said on the sign and more. She, when I stopped to photograph out of my car, she came out the front door firing a shotgun in the air. So some surprises are not worth spending too much time on. I got one frame shot and I was gone out of there. There are other things, secrets if you will, beautiful things. This beautiful old abandoned fishing boat. This is in Port O'Connor, Texas. And this, one of my very favorites. I love photographing all sorts of monuments, including grave markers, monuments in cemeteries. But I just love this. When I found this in Port Lavaca, I could barely believe my eyes. And I love the detective work, even though I'm not always successful at trying to trace some of these things down. So I wanted to know, how did that get here? I've never seen anything in the way of tombstone like that. But I finally, asking around, found myself at the home of Serafino and Margarita Cuellar. These are they. And when I questioned Serafino, he said, yes, those are my brothers, Mingo and Joe. They buried there. Mingo, he died when he was just a boy. He drowned right here. Joe, he drowned too in Galveston on his boat. We don't know how he drowned, but he drowned. So you had the tombstone carved for their graves? No, that was my brother Frank. He was very close with Joe. They always worked together, fishing, And Frank said, Joe don't need a cross or a Jesus. Joe needed fish. So he had fish made for him in a little place called China down in Nuevo Leon. In the same town, I came across this man, Joe Ramos, and his unforgettable story about his kind of family history. I looked at him and I thought, is he Hispanic? He's Hispanic, I guess, but somehow the geography of his face didn't look exactly right. So I said, were you born here? Were your parents born here? He says, well, you see, my mother's mother was a Mayo Indian. They still got them in Mexico, where she was from. They still got them down there. So she was half Mayo and my daddy was half Apache through his mother. When he went to Mexico, down near Tampico, where she was living, he got with my mother, and they come back here to live. So I'm wondering, how did they get across the border? Thinking of how hard it is nowadays for a couple to get in the United States. And he says, now that's a real story. You see, my daddy convinced my mother and her family that they should all come here. But how are they going to get here? Well, they build a big barge, a big flat-bottom barge, and they put everything they have in that barge. And then they start pulling that barge up the coast, pulling it along, following the coast. I said, they pulled the barge all the way from Tampico? Yes, sir, they did. They would pull that barge all day, my daddy said. My daddy and my mama and her daddy and mama, along with their two sisters. They would pull all day and night and then sleep on the beach. Mama, long as she lived, she would tell me, you don't know what work is. That was work, pulling that barge. So how did they decide to stop here in Port O'Connor, I asked. I reckon they got tired of pulling the barge. And they got to the pass here, Pass Cavallo, when they come in and unload the barge, and they settled here. South of Port O'Connor, you get to the beautiful site of Aransas Wildlife Reserve. If you've never been there, you should go. It's a beauty. That's where the whooping cranes nest. And then south of Aransas, you end up in Corpus. This is a view across Corpus Christi Bay. I had not spent much time in Corpus until I started this project, but I had no problem finding what I felt was and is the spiritual center of today's Corpus Christi. It's right here. This is the monument to Selena Quintana Perez, the Texas-born singer who rose to cult status and then national fame before she was murdered at the age of 23. If you visit this monument, the bronze of Selena sits here on Bayview Drive looking right out at the bay. There's a little detail I'll tell you about you should notice. If you go around the back of her, as we're looking at her now, where her leg is raised, her right leg, if you get around where the man in the striped shirt is, a lot of people go through the little barricade, through the bars, and if you look, her right buttock, the bronze, is all shiny from where everybody comes and has to adoringly touch and rub Selena's butt. It's a nice detail. The other thing in Port Arthur that I found tremendously interesting was the Bayview Cemetery. It's the oldest federal cemetery in Texas, and I was exploring there on a windy day, and I wrote this. With the wind gusting from the bay and the cold rain beginning to fall, with drug deals being negotiated on the street outside and grackles watching my every move, the old Bayview Cemetery is a fascinating but slightly unnerving place. A thin marble slab on a rectangular base, roughly 2 feet high. The monument leads sharply forward. I have to kneel and lower my head to ground level in order to look up at the face of the tombstone and read its inscription. Fragments of dried grass, tiny brambles, and chunks of soil cling to the inscription. The slight irregularity of the lettering suggests the carving was done completely by hand. With all the lichen and debris on the stone, I struggled to read the Spanish inscription, which I will translate for you. In memory of that which was the life of Maria de Jesus Juarez, born in Rio Verde, state of San Luis Potosí, Mexico, on the 4th of January, 1850, expired in Corpus Christi on the 24th of October, 1906. Her grieving daughter, Juanita de Reyes, dedicates this monument to her memory. Her soul rests in glory and in peace. What I noticed was that this was the only monument, the only gravestone in the cemetery that was written in Spanish, and it was the only person buried there with a Spanish name. And it was only a couple of years later when I met a lady named Jean Adams, a longtime resident of Corpus Christi, that she said, "Oh, I know that tombstone." She said, "And I don't know exactly who Maria de Jesus Juarez was, but I can bet you that she was someone's much beloved maid. And they managed to somehow get her buried there, despite the fact that there are no other Hispanics buried in." And then she went on to tell me how when she was in high school, you could be sent home from school if you were heard speaking Spanish. A different world. Padre Island is another story. I'm not going to take time to go down there, but I would just tell you that if you ever have the urge to have an adventurous weekend, drive down Padre Island. You can drive 60 miles from where you cross over at outside of Corpus Christi. And when you get down, this is the Big Shell area, they call it, where all of a sudden the sand seems to get deep and the debris gets more plentiful. By the time you get down there and further, there's nothing but treasure hunters, drug dealers, and illegals crossing the incredibly dangerous waters at Mansfield Pass. But it's an adventure. I preferred the highways and the beautiful signs. My fruit stand sign, and the vendors alongside the road. And this is Boca Chica, where the Rio Grande comes into the Gulf of Mexico. in the book I tell the adventure I had there, not a good one. I was photographing there on this day, and I wanted to go out and photograph that guy that was standing out. Look, you see very shallow water. He's like ankle deep. I wanted to go out there and photograph him looking down the river. But I was very self-conscious. I had my big Fuji 6x9 camera on a chest and panoramic camera over my shoulder. And I was very conscious, you know, I'm a gringo with a camera, and these are Mexicans fishing, and some of them are, and I'm just, you know, self-conscious and not really looking and thinking. I walked up close to this guy throwing the net, and you see that man, he's actually standing there in the water. The water went from ground level to like 9 feet in 3 feet. It was a channel of deep water, and I stepped into it with both cameras, neither of which worked anymore. So now here's the northern Mexico coast. I guess I'm doing all right here. We're going to travel from crossing the Rio Grande at just north of Matamoros and following it all the way down to Tampico. And as I've said, what you do is you basically travel one road after another from the highway to the coast. But first of all, you know you're in Mexico when somebody unprompted jumps onto the hood of your car and begins cleaning your windshield for 5 or 10 pesos. I never, as many hundreds of times as I've crossed the border, I never crossed the border without a little bit of trepidation and excitement at the prospects of being there. But the trepidation is there. You know, my very favorite quote about thinking about Mexico is from Jan Morris, the great Welsh writer who wrote this. She says, "Drifting across the border come the unmistakable third world smells of dust cooking and ill-refined petroleum, together with the intoxicating sounds of bells, hoops, and fevered music. What stimulation, one feels, must flourish there. What frustrations and injustices, too. The very presence of that southern bank, looking often enough so much the same as the northern bank, seems to clearly speak of looser morals, freer ways, more bribable officials, less dependable mail deliveries, dirtier streets, better food, hotter sex, more desperate poverty, more horrible prisons, and an altogether better chance of adventure." As you enter Matamoros and pass through it, you know, the road is one kind of continuous market with people selling tires and virgins and chairs, and soon you're kind of out into the countryside again, and there are people herding goats along the road. And what I'm looking for, because I've seen it on a detailed map of Tamaulipas, is this road that you see coming off of Highway 101 up right at the top of the screen. The road appears to go on Google Earth for a few miles and then nothing. But what I really want to try to do is get out to this place. I mean, that's my business, to go to places that I don't know anybody that's been before, to see what's there. And there's the town of El Mezquital, and across the little channel there's another El Te, which I've never been to, but Mezquital is where I'm headed. But I can't find the road, and there's no markings or whatever. I finally see a guy on a burro, and I ask him, you know, where's the road? Adelante, you know, right down there. You'll pass it down there and take a left, and so I find the road, and there it is, going out across the sand, headed to Mezquital. Here's Mezquital. Tough, unrelenting poverty. I didn't spend too much time there. I made a few photographs of people fishing there, and then I'm driving around, going out of town, and I see this guy over to the side of the road, and after a while, as I passed by, he kind of waved to me. So I can't resist that. I pulled over, and he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Houston." He says, "My name is Arturo." And I said, "Well, where are you from?" He said, "Well, I live here now, but I lived in Houston for about 20 years. We talked about that a little while, and I'm looking at his house, which is plywood covered with tar paper, and there's all sorts of stuff kind of half buried in the sand around his house. And I say, I'm thinking to myself, how does this guy get from Houston to here? Why does he get to here? And so I asked him, I said, do you like it here? He said, oh, it's quiet here. And they leave me alone. You know, they don't give me no problem here. He said, the only problem is they don't got no good pastries here. I said, pastries? He said, yeah, bear claws, donuts, eclairs, you know. We got none of that here. All we do is eat fish. So he asked me to bring him some donuts the next time I came, and I did. I wonder if he's still there. I don't know. But that's Arturo of El Mezquital. His hat says, kiss me. South of that road, out to Mezquital, you get down to San Fernando, you take the road out toward the coast from there, and you get to this beautiful site. Carvajal is a tiny little town. Couldn't be more than 50 people living there. But the shoreline is beautiful. I love this picture. The woman with her daughter and her little white dog walking over to see probably her husband who's over fishing for oysters on the side. I love this photograph. And then down the road again, we head out to some ranches. The road out to, what's the name of that place? San Jose de los Leones. That road leads you out to these beautiful ranches. I mean, the part of the part of the North Mexico coast that's really cared for is cared for by ranchers. Had a great swim with these guys in the swimming hole on the Rancho Pericos. This is sort of a monument, sort of a sign. This is the marker on Highway 180 for the Tropic of Capricorn. Humble, but expressive. And this is Tampico, one of my favorite spots on the Mexican coast. Observe the tree growing out of the 8th floor of the house, out of the building on the street there. Tampico is a bustling city, and it's got lots of kind of old stuff, decaying stuff that I love to photograph, the sense of time past. You know, one of the issues of photographing, one of the big issues is, what do you take a picture of? What is the material that you're looking for? When I was in Tampico, I got fascinated by just the human scale of the place and all the people on the streets and walking. And I did a lot of pictures of people just walking and then shopping and enjoying. And I like these pictures, and I included them in the book because I think they, years from now, they will tell people how people dressed there, how they looked, how they groomed. There's a passage in W.H. Auden's poem, Homage to Cleo, where he says, in their dual realms, banalities are beautiful. Nothing is too big or too small or the wrong color. After we are brought face to face with that Cleo, nothing is easy. The way I interpret that is that everything is material for photography. It's all a matter of perspective, and once you realize that, it's a question of what to photograph. Tampico was a very rich and interesting place for me. This is crossing over the Rio Panico, coming out of Tampico, and here is the coast from Tampico down to Veracruz, which is our next segment. This is the Highway 180 coming out of Tampico. You're now on what's called the Costa Esmeralda. It's a fairly pretty part of the coast, not comparable to what we get to later, but it's still a very beautiful spot, and it's a Mexican vacation spot. So there's lots of families that come to swim. As much as I like to photograph signs and vernacular architecture, I also love to photograph people. I love this photograph. I could look at it forever. I was photographing a little tire repair shop when these people pulled in to have their tire fixed, and I walked over and photographed them. And I loved looking at all of their expressions as they looked back at me. And there's something about Mexico for me that's easy in terms of photographing the people. I don't know what it is, but I've always felt comfortable with the people, and it seems like they feel comfortable with me. And so that's one reason it's a pleasurable place for me to photograph. Having a little bit of bad Spanish helps too. So this is in a little town called Vega de la Torre, where you get a tire repair shop, a vulcanizador, opposite the New Mexico, right across the street, the Richard the Express. Monuments are good and bad. This is a beautiful monument at Alamo, monument to the orange worker. It's huge. It's about, I would say, 150 feet across. Shows an orange worker emptying his big basket. It's a difficult monument to photograph, but it's grand and kind of endlessly fascinating. On the other side, there are monuments like this. This is Lázaro Cárdenas in Costa Rica. You know, it kind of defeats the idea of a monument, to have someone looking so bug-eyed and big-eared. Maybe that's how they want their politicians to be remembered. But there's this, and then look at this horrid thing of Miguel de Madrid. I've never known quite what to make of Mexican monuments. And now we're at the most kind of important and interesting place on the entire coast. This is Villarrica. Behind him is the Cerro de Metate, where the archaeological site Quiahuiztlan is located. This area, this town, this community has no markings of what happened here. There's no sign that I can find anywhere. This is the cove where Cortez brought his fleet in and finally sunk his ships so nobody could return. This is the ruins of the foundation of the fort he built there. I think the first structure built by a European in North America, totally unmarked, okay? This is a little outcropping just outside Villarrica, the village. You see the beaches. And this kind of freaks me out, Google Earth, you know. There's the path that I walked up to make the photograph I'm going to show you in a minute. There's the spot where I mean, I can go on Google Earth and I can follow my footsteps up to the top where I make this picture. This is the spot where Cortez landed in 1519, arguably the most historic site in the Americas, and yet there's nothing anywhere marked. Surely, I'm reading from the book now, surely this is the most beautiful site on the entire Gulf Coast. And yet there's not another person in sight, not a trace of another human being. The magnificent vista out across the sea takes my mind back for 5 centuries to what has been called the greatest event in all of history, the discovery of the New World. At this moment, standing on the edge of the world, of the New World, I recall the words of one of the conquistadors. It was a miracle that all these wonderful lands remained unknown to the rest of the world through all of history and were saved by God to be discovered in our time. So there was where Cortez sunk his ships, and there's where I take 24 pages of the book to tell my telling of the conquest of Mexico. I'm a kind of a conquest freak. Every accounting of the conquest I've read multiple times. I find it endlessly fascinating reading, and A&M Press indulged me to let me kind of compile all of those tellings together into my story of that. This is the from the Florentine Codex of Indian watchmen observing the first Spanish ships to come into the Gulf and approach the shore. These are Spaniards encountering Mexicans on the road to Tenochtitlan. And this, of course, is the conquest. There's plenty of history all along this area, not at Villarrica, but this is the ruins at Simpuala, and then there's the ruins at the Casa de Cortez in Antigua. Now we're in the city of Veracruz, Puerto Veracruz, the Mexicans call it. I love this place. I've never been to Havana, but it looks like what I imagine Havana looking like. There are many pleasures. The lecheros, the fabulous coffee drinks they make, the divers that dive for coins at the Embarcadero, the market, probably the best market for my mind in all of Mexico, where love and commerce mingle, everybody has a job. And then this is San Judas Tadeo. I learned about him there. I'd never heard of him before. San Judas is the saint of lost causes. He's also the saint of policemen and prostitutes. But mainly he's the saint of lost. When every other saint fails you, you go to Saint Judas Tadeo. And this is the beautiful cemetery, the Panteón Particular in Veracruz. This is a monument. I'm going to move very quickly here because I'm going to finish in 2 or 3 minutes. But here in the Pantheon Particular, this beautiful carving of the Greek goddess Demeter, weeping for her daughter Persephone, who's been captured by Hades. This is where I really had a feeling somehow I'm meant to see that monument and meant to be aware of what's changing and what's being lost along the coast. So now we're headed south out of Veracruz. Here the highway runs right along the sea, and all of a sudden it's very beautiful. It's a deep blue green. The beach is largely unpopulated. Along the highway are all sorts of wonderful little mom and pop restaurants, vendors selling everything from carved animals to tamales. You go through the great river town of Tlacotalpan, just off the highway, where the river flows nearby, and the Central Plaza. This is a beautiful, beautiful village. It's a UNESCO Heritage of Mankind site. My favorite thing there was Uncle Tio Blas and his mini zoological museum, where pelicans and alligators and hawks all live together, more or less. South of Tlacotalpan, I looked for a road leading off to the left. Actually, a French couple had told me about this the first time. They had been hitchhiking through here, and they told me, you know, about an hour out of Tlacotalpan, look for a road unnumbered that goes to the left off the highway, and I found it. All of a sudden, the land is extremely hilly. And off in the distance, looking kind of south, you can see the tip of the volcano San Martin Tuzla. So this is volcanic territory. Very beautiful landscape. This is a little village of Playa Hermosa. And I happened one day to have the good luck. This is why you go to places many times. One time you hit something like this, where they're pulling in a big seine net. The whole village is down there pulling the net, bringing it in. There's the catch. And look at the puffer fish they got. So from there, the highway continues to lead around the volcano. There are rivers coming down every quarter of a mile. Children swimming in the rivers. This is the road. If you look to the left of this image, you can see the cone of the volcano. This is a place I've never been dying to go. There's this immense rainforest up around the cone of the volcano. And south of Montepillo, I found this little road. The white line that I've marked there is the road, 2 miles, 1.9 miles long. This is where I decided to end it when I took this road. It started with this beautiful kind of semi-hidden entrance with white butterflies floating around, sunlight and shadow. The old stone road continues through this canopy of tropical foliage. Here and there I see children running out in the fields playing, cross over a river, shining in the sunlight. I get a glimpse of the sea, horses grazing, and I have to explore that hillside, and I found these amazing volcanic rocks. I guess they were rocks. They looked to me like sleeping spirits in the field, markers of history or time or something, leaves and what looked like the impressions of leaves on rocks, and a grave marker, a single grave marker of a virgin. And then the road goes up again. And from the crest of the road, you can see out across this amazing landscape. Then the road rises again, and it goes up to the top of the headland, where there's this old hotel that's now crumbling apart. I remember when I was leaving Houston, and for an instant I imagined the city in ruins. Suddenly that vision comes alive again in my mind. And I see in vivid detail the still and empty remains of the once shining city. What had been once city streets are now dense forests of pines and live oaks, dripping with Spanish moss. Still the old brown bayou flows through the heart of the abandoned city, and a maze of crumbling freeways encircles it all. Then the vision of the city passes and I return to the reality of this place. The view of the sea before me, the presence of the volcano behind me, and the magical road that brought me here. All of this is real, and at this moment, it's mine. A series of 480 stone steps lead down the headland to the beach. The waves wrap around my feet and wash onto the sand, surge over the black rocks, the white tips of the waves rising and falling across the brown sand and the dark rocks, make a series of rhythmic drawings for my camera to capture. How could it be, I wonder? How could it possibly be that this perfect place has been saved for all these years for me and for me alone to find? Thank you very much.